Hey everyone, and welcome again to History 131. I'm Mr. Harris, your instructor, and today I'll focus on the people, developments, and circumstances that led to the collision of European and Native American cultures in the 16th century Americas, that is, North and South America. The purpose of this lecture is to help you address two important prompts. First, and this is from David Emery Shy's textbook, America. First, why were there so many diverse human societies in the Americas before the Europeans arrived? Secondly, what significant developments in Europe enabled the age of exploration? The answers to these prompts will provide background from which the North Carolina North America became what Shy called, quote, dynamic crossroads of adventurous people from around the world, end quote. These people contributed diverse heritages, technologies, cultures, religions, and motivations, which altogether formed America's multicultural society. All right, all my information comes directly from our textbook, which is accessible in the modules, and that's Shy's America, the Essential Early Learning Edition, Volume 1. All right, so where did the Native Americans come from? According to Shy, North and South America were the last continents to be inhabited by Homo sapiens, that's people. And Shy makes the conventional arguments that thousands of years ago, maybe between 10 and 20,000 years ago, no one knows exactly, during the Ice Age, immigrants from Northeast Asia came across what today is eastern Siberia, and they made their way across a frozen land bridge of ice and tundra from Siberia to what today is Alaska. And they came over that bridge, came to America. So, according to this theory, ice that had covered glaciers, perhaps 2 miles thick, that had covered most of North Carolina, as those melted over the centuries, these people made their way down from what was Alaska and what was Canada, and they came down into America to the prairies, to the woodlands, uh, to the uh, to the plains, and to what today is the Old Northwest, and wherever they went, they sort of adapted to the places where they were. Initially, these people called Paleo Indians. They were hunters and gatherers, and they worked together in groups. They took down large animals like mastodon, giant bison, prehistoric bears, larger than the bears today, if you can imagine. And they foraged for things like berries, nuts, roots, wild plants. So eventually, these people spread through the continents and the plains over the centuries into the deserts, and they adapted. And um, at some point, global warming led to the extinction of these larger animals like giant bison and mammoths. And the hunters adjusted. They hunted smaller game like deer, antelope, caribou, and they became skilled fishermen and trappers. Um, so everything started to change. Initially, these Paleo Indians were in clans, but over the years, those clans merged into what we call nations, and they had these. The nations had shared languages, cultures, religion. And around 7,000 BCE, before that means before Common Era, these hunter gatherers, many of them transitioned into farming cultures. They started to grow crops seasonally. The main crops were corn or maize, squash, beans, avocados, pumpkins, and even chili peppers. Hunting remained important, though. It was an important cultural aspect of the nations, and it was a rite of passage. Uh, so many Native Americans considered maize or corn the cornerstone of their diets, and some of them called it the gift of the gods. So with this agricultural revolution, the nations had more abundant food, sometimes surpluses, that allowed them to settle in larger villages. The villages grew in population, and their societies became larger and more advanced. All right. So, of all these civilizations in the Americas, most advanced emerged in Mesoamerica, or what today is Central America and Mexico. You can see the map there of the different civilizations that emerged. The Aztec, um, or the Mexica. That's their proper name is Mexica, but in the 19th century they became known as Aztec. Before them, there were the Maya, and the Maya were in what today is Central America. And in South America, there were the Inca. So these civilizations had sophisticated agriculture, power, palaces, bridges, and they also had temple top pyramids. The Aztec or the Mexicans and the Maya did. The Inca were more known for their stone buildings, but they had temples as well. They were elaborate stone temples. So on the left, you'll see a Mayan temple down in the corner. That was Chichen Itza. That was built sometime between 800 and 900 CE, Common Era, on the Yucatan Peninsula, which is modern day southeastern Mexico. So of all these civilizations, the Mexicas or the Aztecs arguably impacted American history the most. However, I'm going to give overviews of the Maya and the Inca societies before I really focus in on the Mexicas. So the Maya emerged in Central America. They came before the Mexicas and the Incas. They emerged around 300 CE. And they were dominant for about 6 centuries. They had a written language, elaborate art and architecture. They used astronomy and mathematics to great effect. They had a calendar that was more accurate than any European calendars until the age of exploration, really. So the Mayans had large cities, terraced farms, and elaborate pyramids, highly sophisticated. Their civilization collapsed around 900 CE, maybe because of famine, drought, disease, civil wars, crop failures. Could have been ecological disasters, but they were defeated by the Toltecs in the 10th century. Toltecs came from northern Mexico, stayed around for a while, but then they withdrew. Shai says because of fires, droughts, and invasions. In South America, there was the Inca Empire, and that spanned along the Andes Mountains, about 2,500 miles. So between 1300 and 1500 CE, the Incas thrived in South America. They had elaborate stone buildings, irrigated farms, extensive networks of paved roads. Actually, their um, longest road was about 30% longer than our Highway 40, which goes from the coast of North Carolina to the coast of California. Their network of roads spanned 25,000 miles, and it laced the Andes mountain range, which was quite a feat. It's it's comparable to the roads that were in the Roman Empire. So archaeologists estimate that at the height of the empire there were 6 to 14 million people. They can't tell because they didn't have written records, but archaeologists do know that the Inca Empire, the people of the empire spoke 20 different languages. All right, Mexicus, the most powerful empire in 1500. They originally came from somewhere in or northern Mexico. They moved down to central Mexico, took over the highlands over time, built their capital at Tenochtitlan on Lake Texcoco, and that's in present-day Mexico City. Tenochtitlan means place of the stone cactus. They built a sophisticated society. The emperor was at the top. Under him were two social classes: a ruling class, which was about 5% of the population. The ruling class consisted of warriors and priests and nobles. And then there were commoners. Those were farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and enslaved people. So when the Spanish reached the Caribbean in 1492, um, and then they subsequently came to Mexico in the early 16th century, There were 371 city-states in the Mexican Empire, and that was organized into 38 provinces. And they were also connected by a network of paved roads. Hernan Cortez, when he got to Tenochtitlan, the Mexican capital, in 1519, he described enormous stone temples, paved streets, a busy marketplace, 70,000 adobe huts where the inhabitants lived. It was bigger than Paris. It was bigger than Constantinople, bigger than London. There were about 200,000 people living in Tenochtitlan at the time. Agriculturally, the Mexicas were advanced. They used large-scale irrigation. Actually, Tenochtitlan was on a lake, and they basically had floating fields, and that was how they irrigated their crops. It was also a good way to protect the city. It was like a moat around the city. They also had terraced fields. They also rotated their crops so they wouldn't deplete the soil. Um, so today, they're most remembered for their sophisticated architecture and artwork. You see some of that artwork there. They were polytheists. They believed in many gods, worshiped many gods. They thought human life was connected to elements like the sun, the stars, the rain, and every living creature. But they believed it was necessary to make continuous human sacrifices to their gods for their civilization to survive. So we have an image here of Mexican priests. They were at the main temple. They were doing their weekly sacrifice ritual. They would get virgins or people who were captured in wars. They would give them hallucinogens, take them up to the top of the temple. Priest would cut out their heart while they were still alive and offer it to the sun god. So there was a constant need for sacrifices. Therefore, the Mexicans were always at war with their neighbors. This made them unpopular in many respects, and made it easier for the Spanish to ally with their neighbors when Hernan Cortez invaded in 1519. For the Mexico, war was considered honorable, heroic, and necessary. All right. So after the Maya collapse, the Toltec left, you had the rise of the Mexicas in what today is central Mexico, and the Inca in South America. They had advanced mathematics, architecture, infrastructure, and agriculture. But the Inca never developed a written language. The Mexicas and the Mayas did. All right. So not only were there diverse, sophisticated cultures in uh, South America, but there was a diversity of cultures in North America. Uh, Around 1500, there were about 8 million people in North Carolina. That was before it was settled by Europeans, and there were about 240 societies. So over the centuries, as I've mentioned, these small groups had merged into nations. The clans had merged into nations with shared oral traditions, social beliefs, religious rituals. All right, and the Sioux, as one example, believed in the Great Spirit, who they called Wakan Tonka. All right, and they believed that people were connected with nature. Um, they, including animals, that's land and sea creatures, and including even like rocks and trees, rivers, and elements of the weather. Um, so a lot of Indian nations actually, or Native American nations, believed that spirits protected them in battle. And war was very important for most Native American nations. They considered courage in battle to be the top virtue, and they therefore emphasized hunting. Hunting was a way to promote and develop military skills such as teamwork, perseverance, survival, marksmanship, and getting tough from being out in the wild. In contrast to the Europeans who liked large battles, linear battles, you might say, where people line up against each other or where they take over territory. Native American war was usually like small scale raids and ambush, what today we might even call asymmetric warfare, patrolling, and in this kind of warfare, the courage of the individual was more important than, say, the European uh, idea of like unit cohesion. A big military unit. Um, sticking together, working together to accomplish a common task, unity of effort. So Native American warfare emphasized more individual courage. Um, so before combat or hunts, tribes like the Sioux or the Comanche, they would have war dances. They would try to get the favor of the spirits who would theoretically protect them in battle. Uh, so not only did the nations have diverse religions, um, but they had sophisticated governments and diverse governments as well, cultures and religious practices, and even economies. Uh, Most nations were ruled by chiefs, which who often did not have absolute power. In a lot of cases, the people themselves chose the chiefs. That was based on merit or popularity, or most of all, skill in warfare. If whoever was a good warfare, a good warrior, was a candidate to be a chief. That's that's not unlike our culture, the American culture, where a lot of former generals used to be presidents, like George Washington and Eisenhower. Uh, so the chiefs often had to persuade people to adopt policies. It was quasi-democratic in some nations, you could say, based on their good reasoning and their popularity. In the Indian nations, men were typically the leaders, warriors, and the hunters, and the women did domestic tasks like watching the children, growing and harvesting crops, making food and pottery and blankets, and curing and drying animal skins. Uh, in some nations, like the Cherokee and the Five Nation Iroquois, Five Nation Iroquois were the Oneida, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Women managed the villages, and they had significant power. So now I'll give you an overview of the different nations by region. All right. In the northwest, you had the Haida, the Kwakiutl, and the Nootka. And they were along the Pacific coast from what today is northern California all the way to southern Alaska. They were known for their elaborate woodwork, totem poles, carved animals, like the bird over on the right. The Haida, the Kwakiutl, and the Nootka were great fishermen. They were whalers too. They used the big trees along the coast of California and Oregon to carve out huge dugout canoes that could hold about 50 people. Sometimes the biggest ones could hold 50 people. So they would use those and they would go whaling. Uh, so their society was divided into chiefs, commoners, and slaves. Then in the southwest, in what today is Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, Shai identified the Anasazi, which means cliff dwellers or basket makers, as the most widespread. And they were an older nation, and they were actually the ancestors of the later nations, the Hopi and the Zuni. The Anasazi didn't have a rigid class structure like the Mexicas. They only engaged in war for self-defense. So you had to really upset them before they would go to war. And they built stone pueblos, Anasazi, under ridges like the one in this image here. Uh, Zuni and the Hopis still live in pueblos in the mountains. You can go see them in New Mexico and Arizona. Uh, Very interesting. I've been there myself. It'd be a great trip if you want to go out and see what pueblos look like. And those pueblos were built by their ancestors. Then you had the Plains Indians. They're the most probably the most well known in American memory. a lot of people associate teepees with Native Americans. Not all Native Americans lived in teepees, but the Plains Indians did. The Sioux, the Arapaho, the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, Comanche, Crow, and Apache nations. They were Plains Indians, and they were still hunter gatherers. They followed herds of bison, buffalo along the prairie. That was a vast region. The prairie stretched from what today is Canada all the way to what today is Texas, and it was bound by the Mississippi River in the east and the Rocky Mountains in the west. So just a huge sea of grass where the buffalo roamed, and they would follow the buffalo. Uh, so they also supplemented their diets with seeds, roots, nuts, and berries. Uh, and they are a good example of what Shai called the difference between Native American and Christian religious perspectives. So at that time, around the 16th century, when the Spanish were really exploring and settling the Americas, Europeans believed that humans were separate from nature and superior to it, and like it says in Genesis in the Bible that people had dominion over the world and its resources. Native Americans, on the other hand, believe that people were related and connected with nature, uh, and animals on land and in the lakes and in the ocean, as well as like rocks, trees, mountains, and even rivers. Um, so we have the Plains Indians, right? And east of the plains, from the Mississippi all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean, you had the Mississippian peoples. The Adena Hopewell culture, for example, and then the Cahokia. The Adena and then the Hopewell societies thrived from 700 BCE. That's 700 years before Jesus, to 200 CE, 200 years after him. They built large burial mounds in the shapes of birds, snakes, and other animals. They're still around. You can go and visit these places throughout the South and in some places in the Midwest. Mississippians grew corn, tobacco, squash, sunflowers, and beans. Their most developed civilization was Cahokia, and that flourished between 600 and 1300 CE. It's located where the Missouri River merges with the Mississippi River. It's in present day Illinois. It's across the river from Missouri. So the Cahokians um, were large scale corn harvesters. They had a surplus of corn, so that enabled them to build a good sized city, about 15,000 inhabitants at its height on 3,200 acres. It was surrounded by a barrier built out of logs. Um, Around 1400, the Cahokians vanished, and there's a debate about why they vanished. Uh, some archaeologists and historians speculate they might have cut down too many trees to make their defensive barrier. So when the area flooded, it eroded the topsoil, and it made the topsoil um, unproductive for growing crops. This might have compelled them to leave. Personally, I think that um, the Mississippi River Valley just floods a lot. If you paid attention to the news in the past 3 decades, the area is prone to flooding. So they probably just went to a different place that further west or in the south that doesn't flood. That's what makes the most sense to me. All right, and then you had the eastern woodland peoples. All right, they went from the Atlantic seaboard uh, to Maine all the way to Louisiana. So from Maine to Louisiana, there were three groups of the eastern woodland people: the Algonquian, the Iroquoian, and the Muskogean. All right, and these were the first Native American groups that came into contact with European settlers who came to the east coast of America. The Algonquin speakers lived in the region from New England to the Great Lakes and south down to the Carolinas. They had villages that ranged from about 500 to 2,000 people. They lived in multifamily longhouses called wigwams. We're going to read about that pretty soon in the primary sources. They surrounded their villages with timber fences. The sharpened trees stood up and they were a defensive barrier. They were called palisades. They were skilled hunters, fishermen, and they grew squash, corn, and beans. They also foraged for berries, fruits, and nuts. Um, they called, along with other Indian nations or Native American nations, squash, corn, and beans, they called them the Three Sisters because they grew well together. Um, so to the south and the west of the Algonquins, you had the Iroquoian-speaking nations, all right? And those were the Seneca, the Onondaga, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, and the Tuscarora. Iroquois nations went from upstate New York down all the way from Georgia. They were also hunters and farmers. Their villages were 3,000 people or more, and they lived in long houses covered in bark. So now in the Algonquin culture, the men pretty much ran the show, but in the Iroquoian culture, um, women had a lot of power. Like clan mothers were the oldest women in the villages, and they managed the long houses. They were kind of like managers for apartments, basically. Uh, they also arranged marriages, managed slaves, grew crops. They controlled the distribution of property, and they even chose the chiefs sometimes. So they had a central role in the Iroquois culture. And part of that was because men were absent quite a bit, hunting, trading, or engaged in warfare. So the Muskogeans were the uh, third major eastern woodland group, the Muskogeans. Those were the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Natchez, and the Appalachee, and also the Timucua. Uh, so with the Iroquois, these were matrilineal societies. Ancestry flowed from the mother's line. The Muskogeans lived in thatched roofed houses without walls because of the mild winters in the south and the hot summers, and their towns were arranged around large central plazas. So overall, uh, these diverse North American natives were incredibly resilient. They adapted to varied environments, wars, and shifting climates. Uh, and they also would later adapt to the presence of Europeans. Their interaction and adaptation to the Europeans would shape subsequent history. So, having covered the diversity of cultures and civilizations in pre Columbian North and South America, that's North and South America prior to Columbus's landfall in the Bahamas and the subsequent colonization, I'm going to address the second prompt. So I'm going to summarize the significant developments in Europe that gave rise to the age of exploration. So according to Schei, European exploration, known as the Age of Discovery, was made possible by the Renaissance, technological innovations, sustained population growth, the rise of a middle class, and decline of feudalism, powerful new nations, improved systems of finance, and religious conflict. So until the end of the 15th century, which was the time of Christopher Columbus, most of Europe used or was part of a feudal system. And under feudalism, poor peasants or serfs would work for a ruling class of nobles. In exchange for that, they'd have a place to live on the nobles' land. But during the second half of the 15th century, a new middle class of merchants, skilled craftsmen, bankers, and financiers arose, and they created a dynamic new economy that was based on trade. So, with the rise of this middle class and the growing economic strength of European nations, particularly Portugal, Spain, France, and England, the requirement the old requirement for peasants to remain in one place no longer was applicable, no longer was necessary. That sort of faded away, and this led to the decline of feudalism and the rise of again a trade-based economy. And in this trade-based economy, you had the development of currency, banking, accounting, and insurance, as well as revenues from trade and taxes from the merchant class. So you had a improved, more sophisticated, and a stronger system of finance, which allowed the monarchs, kings and queens, uh, princes, and so forth, to be freed from their former dependence on the nobles. They used to depend on nobles to get money to do things. They would have to ask the nobles for money. Didn't have to do that anymore because they could just tax this rising middle class. And over time, the middle class started to replace the uh, nobles as the ruling class. And as this happened, uh, cities began to grow. Cities like London, Liverpool, Paris, right? And these cities, which some of them had been independent formerly, well, the as the monarchs grew in power, they brought these cities under their control. They established stronger central governments, um, which became more powerful because they could tax the middle class more. So again, this new class of merchants and bankers, middle class people started to replace the landed nobility as the ruling elite. Uh, so, contemporary with this and contributing to the rise of the middle class was the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth. This was a cultural and intellectual movement. It thrived in Europe from the 15th to about the 17th century. Started off in the Italian city-states. What today is Italy was not unified at the time. There were city-states like Florence, Venice, and so forth, uh, Rome, right? And the Renaissance was inspired by particularly by Florentines like Niccolo Machiavelli and Leonardo da Vinci. And these Renaissance men rediscovered ancient texts from Greek and Rome that included advanced mathematics, architecture, engineering, artwork. And this inspired a cultural and scientific revolution known as the Renaissance. So it starts in Italy in about 1500, and it manifests itself in Europe, spreads across Europe in different ways and shapes for about 200 years. The Renaissance. Uh, and as a result, there were a significant number of intellectuals, rulers, and elites. They started to have what was called a more humanist perspective. And what that means is these humanists, they would downplay the old conventional belief that God was all powerful and omnipotent and controlled everything, and instead they emphasized that humans had the ability to solve problems themselves. Mind over matter is one way to say it. So in this climate, the educated people, many among the middle class, started to question the authority of the rulers and the clergy, clergy meaning church leaders. And they started to embrace controversial ideas and creativity in arts and sciences. And these changes and this questioning of the old establishment led to important new scientific discoveries and innovations. And some of these achievements, some of these innovations, contributed directly to the age of exploration. For instance, better navigation instruments for ships. People could people out in the ocean could pretty much tell where they were now, whereas in the past the navigation instruments were much less reliable. And you also had larger and more seaworthy ships. They could store more goods. They were more durable, and they could go longer distances. So this laid the groundwork for the age of exploration. Other innovations that fed the age of exploration or the age of discovery were gunpowder, firearms, and cannons, and the printing press. And I'll tell you how in a minute. But with cannons and guns, wherever these explorers went, they had fire superiority essentially over whoever they encountered. So that enabled them to trade, discover, and colonize without usually without fear of being defeated, but sometimes they were anyway. Uh, so this was particularly true. These developments particularly happened in Spain, Portugal, France, and England, and discovery, global trade, colonization was popularized by the printing press. So from the 15th century through the 16th, the Portuguese took the lead in global exploration and commerce. They used cutting edge sailboats called the caravels, which were outfitted with the latest cannons. And they would explore and they would establish trade depots, like in the Canary Islands, along the coast of Africa, and all the way over to Southeast Asia. Portuguese got rich from trading guns, gold, grains, ivory, and enslaved human cargo. From China and Japan, they would bring back spices, silk, medicinal herbs, and other exotic goods, and those became the rage in the Western markets. Another major development was the marriage of King Ferdinand II of Aragon to Queen Isabella of Castile in 1469. Uh, their their kingdoms unified and became the powerful nation of Spain. And to add to that, by January 1st, 1492, Spain defeated the Muslims who were on the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is Spain and Portugal. So they had been at war with the Muslims for 9 centuries, and that holy war was known as the Reconquista. So when they won the Reconquista, they consolidated their power, and they gave Muslims and Jews an ultimatum that they could either convert to Catholicism or they could leave the peninsula, which many of them did. Uh, so their consolidation of power, the Kingdom of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Renaissance, science and technology, stronger central governments, powerful nation states, the middle class again. Um, these factors opened the way and enabled Europe to more aggressively and more robustly begin to explore the not only around Africa and the Indian Ocean and all the way to Asia, but the Western Hemisphere as well, as we're about to see. So Christopher Columbus, lovely man, born in what today is Italy, Genoa, in 1451. Uh, he knew Latin. He was familiar with geography and navigation. He wanted to get rich, and he claimed that he wanted to spread Christianity, uh, which is debatable. We'll see why. So, despite popular misinformation, it didn't take Columbus to show everybody that the world was round. Most educated people at the time of Columbus thought that the world was round, but he was the first explorer to aggressively propose a voyage across the Atlantic to what today is Asia, to open up trade with Asia, transatlantic trade with Asia. He proposed it to the English, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish monarchs. First, they all rejected him. Finally, in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to finance his voyage. So he took his first expedition on August 3rd, 1492. His 3 ships, pictured above, the Nina, Pinta, the Santa Maria, had a harrowing voyage, right? The sailors were starving. They were uh, running out of uh, their water supply, their supply of small beer, right? And they started to mutiny by October 12th. Finally, somebody discovered land on October 12th as they were beginning to mutiny. They landed on the island of South San Salvador, which is in the Bahamas. They thought they had reached the East Indies. Columbus called the inhabitants there Indians, which is why that name stuck. But it's a misnomer. Uh, the inhabitants on San Salvador were known as Taínos. They couldn't get rid of Columbus and his crews. They offered him parrots, food, water, and spears. But Columbus considered them friendly but inferior savages who were ideal for conversion to Christianity and forced servitude, that is, slavery. Uh, and he left some of some of his people behind there on San Salvador, and he essentially pronounced that the natives had to bring him gold every so often. So he basically exploited the people there, uh, turned them into servants. He left San Salvador, sailed along the coast of Cuba. He thought that was part of Asia. And he visited the island of Hispaniola, which is actually Haiti in the Dominican Republic. So there he forced the natives to bring him a thimbleful of gold each month, and anyone who didn't comply would have their hands cut off. So he goes back to Spain, and he mistakenly tells Ferdinand and Isabella that he had reached the Indies. They were very excited. Uh, News of Columbus's voyage is spread because of the printing press, and it stoked the Europeans' interest in exploration. Uh, so as a result, the Age of Discovery would really thrive for two more centuries. So another thing that happened was the discovery of new people, cultures, plants, and animals caused a lot of Europeans to question old accepted Christian worldviews. Um, the Spanish monarchs decided to send Columbus back, but they instructed him to, quote, treat the Indians very well and lovingly and abstain from doing them any injury, end quote, which is the opposite of what he did, really. He was apparently successful in reaching the outskirts of Asia. Uh, so the Spanish monarchs were worried as news spread about his success, and therefore they made a treaty with Portugal. The Spanish and the Portuguese made a treaty. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And as a result, Spain got most of the territory in the Western Hemisphere, while Portugal got what later became Brazil. And they also had control of Africa. The Portuguese controlled Africa. So as a result, Spain would have an empire in the Americas. It was called New Spain, while Portugal dominated the Atlantic slave trade. Um, so Columbus took a second voyage in 1493, went back to Hispaniola. His men weren't very popular there. They plundered the villages and raped a lot of women. The inhabitants, enraged, had turned against the Spanish, and to make matters worse, Columbus enslaved 400 of the Arawak Indians, took them back to Spain. Uh, Isabella was horrified. She said, who is this man who thinks he can enslave my vassals? So she sent an investigator from the royal court, Francis Bobadilla, to on Columbus's third voyage in 1498 to investigate. And when they reached Hispaniola, the first thing that Bobadilla saw were 6 dead Spaniards who had been strung up by the natives. So Bobadilla immediately relieved Columbus of his governorship of Hispaniola. Columbus protested. He was shackled, shipped back to Spain, and jailed. but he would always claim that he had found the outskirts of Asia, which was incorrect. Um, he was a broken man. He went to America again in 1502, but um, that voyage was pretty inconsequential. But he got the ball rolling for the exploration of the Western Hemisphere, nonetheless. Another Italian-born explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, sailed for Portugal in 1499, and he actually definitively concluded that Columbus had not reached Asia. Vespucci was also looking for a route to Asia, but instead he explored Brazil and the South American coastline. He concluded that America was a whole new continent, actually two continents, North and South America. So when the German map maker Martin Waldseemüller made the first map that captured the Western Hemisphere, Waldseemüller labeled the New World America, which comes from the feminine Latin variant of Vespucci's first name. England also got in on the game before Vespucci. John Cabot sailed from England in 1497 to what today is Canada. He called it the Newfound Land. And his discoveries became the basis for England's claim to the entirety of North America, which conflicted with a Spanish claim. Spain got nervous, so they decided to create another colony in what today is modern day Puerto Rico in 1505. So they left some settlers there, as well as some livestock, basically to get a foothold to create a bulwark against more European settlement by other non-Spanish nations. So, as previously mentioned, religious conflicts significantly influenced events in the Western Hemisphere. At the time of Columbus's voyages, most Europeans recognized the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, but Shy pointed out that efforts of men like Columbus to convert the Native Americans to Catholicism were an example of, quote, the murderous intensity in which Europeans braced Christianity, end quote. So on this slide, we have two leaders of what were really parallel Protestant reformations in Western Europe. To Martin Luther above, he was a German monk. He posted his 95 Thesis on the door of the Castle Church, Wittenberg, in 1517, what today is Germany. And he protested what he considered the corruption of the Catholic Church, what he called non-biblical doctrines like transubstantiation. And that's where people take communion, they drink the wine, eat the bread, and upon the blessing of a clergyman, after that's consumed, it turns into the uh, the flesh and blood of Jesus, transubstantiation. So Luther said that was non-biblical. He also protested priests who sold indulgences. That's taking money and telling people that they're saved because they give the clergyman money. So offering salvation in exchange for money, or saying that they're freeing the people who give money are freeing their loved ones, their deceased loved ones from purgatory or hell. So Martin Luther said that was rubbish, and he decried or criticized corrupt tax exempt clergy who oftentimes were poorly educated, went to concubines, and exerted what critics considered negative influences on the population. So Luther previously emphasized obedience to rulers, but in his Augsburg Confession, he said that local rulers had the right and the duty to resist rulers who are allied with the Pope, who he said was allied with Antichrist. So he uh, he considered the Catholic clergy a den of murderers and robbers. That's what he said, and he said that common people could achieve salvation through quote faith alone end quote without the intervention of church officials. So Pope Leo X excommunicated Martin Luther, and the Holy Roman Emperor declared Martin Luther a heretic and an outlaw, tried to have him arrested, but Luther was protected by German princes. So when the German princes protected him, that led to a clash, which turned into religious wars. Uh, there were religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. Protestants is those people who followed the doctrine of Martin Luther. Uh, so the Protestants embraced Luther's revolutionary confessions of faith. There were decades of civil war. Both sides the Protestants and the Catholics tried to crush dissent. They burned each other at the stake. They called each other heretics. But by 1555, at the Treaty of Augsburg, uh, both sides um, halted for a while, and German princes were allowed to determine what religion their subjects would embrace. But by the time of the treaty, most of the German states in Scandinavia, that's Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, had become Lutheran. But the religious wars would continue really for about 2 centuries. So below Luther, there you have John Calvin. He was a French born theologian. Uh, he led Swiss Protestants from the city of Geneva. He also emphasized, like Luther, the omnipotence or all powerful nature of God, and he preached salvation by faith alone. So he asserted the innate depravity and sinful nature of humankind, and he said that salvation was only achievable through the grace of Jesus Christ, which he said was a free gift from God. This was Calvinism. Another part of Calvinism, something that John Calvin preached, was predestination. That meant at the beginning of time, God essentially decided who was going to be saved and who wasn't, the elect and the damned, essentially. So only through God's salvation and grace, according to Calvin, could people be saved, and by faith. So alongside Lutheranism, Calvin's doctrine spread like wildfire through the Netherlands, France, into parts of Germany and throughout Scotland. Uh, According to Shai, Calvinism had the most influence on religious practices and the faith of the English colonies than any other faith of the Reformation. And Calvinism would become fundamental to American religion, culture, and political development. Not all Protestant faiths were Calvinist, but the infusion or the entry of Calvinist writings into England after the reign of King Edward VI sort of opened the way for what Shai calls a broad-based religious heritage, and that would shape Puritanism, Anglicanism, and Presbyterianism. So the Catholics did not take this lying down. The Catholics staged a counter Reformation where they tried to root Protestantism out from Europe. For example, the Spanish Inquisition, that was a movement in Spain by people like Ignatius Loyola. And essentially, groups would go around, priests and soldiers, they would interrogate people about their faith, terrorize and kill non-Catholics, torture non-Catholics, and sometimes burn them at the stake. So on the other side, the Protestants did the same thing in other regions, and essentially you just had these intense religious wars in Europe after Martin Luther and John Calvin for 2 centuries. The Reformation uniquely influenced England. Prior to King Henry VIII, England was solidly Catholic. Henry VIII, however, was unable to produce a male heir. He was unable to, in other words, to have a boy who would take control of his kingdom after him. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, uh, Henry requested a divorce from her to the Pope. The Pope did not grant him a divorce, but he divorced her anyway. Uh, so he cut his ties, Henry VIII, with the Catholic Church in 1533. He was excommunicated. Um, the British Parliament made Henry VIII leader of the Church of England anyway. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, had a daughter named Elizabeth. Upset, Henry called Elizabeth a bastard child. But Elizabeth, nevertheless, although rejected, became one of the most cunning, resourceful, and powerful leaders in the history of England. So Henry had four more wives, uh, two of whom he executed on false charges of infidelity. He only had one male heir, Edward V, who ruled shortly from starting in 1547, but he died of tuberculosis. Edward was a Protestant who persecuted Catholics. He was succeeded by a Catholic, Mary I, who became known as Bloody Mary because she persecuted Protestants. She had a short reign too. She was replaced by Elizabeth I, who became queen in 1588. Elizabeth was tough. She survived several assassination attempts, and she was an effective ruler for 45 years. She did persecute Catholics, however. Never married, she was known as the Virgin Queen. She once said, "I may be a woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a man." Under Elizabeth, England defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, which had been the most powerful navy in the world, and this opened up the Western Hemisphere to English explorers and coloners. So England became a major player in North American colonization from that point on. So, in conclusion, North and South America, uh, prior to the arrival of the Europeans, had become a dynamic crossroads. Now, the Norse, the Vikings, had visited places in North America by the 10th century, but they didn't really have the advanced enough ships, and they were too far uh, from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden really to establish permanent colonies. And so those colonies that were in really all the way to Newfoundland, they're really their last major colony um, was in Greenland, but that didn't last. So, but prior to the arrival of the Spanish, North and South America was what Shai called a dynamic crossroads. You had a lot of sophisticated cultures with diverse systems of government, advanced systems of government, agricultural techniques, and a lot of different languages. Uh, so in Mesoamerica and South America, you had the most advanced civilizations, the Mayas, the Incas, and the Aztecs. And then you had key developments in Europe, technological changes, the Renaissance, population growth, advanced systems of finances, a rising middle class, feudalism was on the way out, uh, and religious wars. And those are the things that push the age of discovery. Uh, Thank you very much for listening to my lecture. If you haven't already, don't forget to read chapters uh, or pages 7 through 19 in Shai this week and take the academic integrity quiz so that the school won't drop you from the class. Again, you'll have 2 opportunities to take each quiz. So take the quizzes, go ahead and take that academic integrity quiz before you start the other ones, especially. And good luck this week, and I look forward to seeing you in class.